Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. 2 months into our marriage, my wife Jenna and I stumbled across what seemed like the deal of a lifetime while scrolling through budget travel sites at 3 in the morning. A rustic villa in Tuscany for less than half the usual rate, available for the exact week we needed. The photos showed sun-drenched stone walls covered in climbing jasmine, a pool overlooking endless hills of olive groves, and bedrooms with those gorgeous exposed wooden beams you only see in Italian architecture magazines. The listing came from a small agency called Bella Vista Rentals, and though their website looked pretty basic, the reviews seemed genuine enough. 28 years old and drowning in student loans, we figured we deserved at least one nice thing after our courthouse wedding. So we booked it immediately, sending the deposit through an international wire transfer that took forever to process at the bank. The drive from Florence Airport should have taken 90 minutes according to Google Maps, but we spent almost 4 hours winding through increasingly narrow roads that our rental Fiat barely squeezed through. Each turn took us deeper into the countryside, past abandoned farmhouses with caved-in roofs and fields that hadn't seen cultivation in decades. Jenna kept making jokes about horror movies while filming everything on her phone, but I could tell she was getting nervous when we lost cell signal about an hour from the villa. The property manager, a guy named Giorgio who spoke maybe 10 words of English, met us at a gas station 5 miles away because, according to him, the final stretch was too confusing for foreigners to navigate alone. He drove ahead in a beaten-up Alfa Romeo that belched black smoke, leading us down a dirt road so rough I thought we'd lose our exhaust system before we even arrived. The villa itself was exactly like the photos, which should have been our first real warning sign since nothing on vacation ever matches the advertising. Every detail was perfect, from the antique copper pots hanging in the kitchen to the fresh lavender bundles tied to each bedpost, almost like someone had staged it 5 minutes before we walked in. Giorgio handed us 3 different keys on a heavy brass ring, explaining through gestures and broken phrases that one opened the main door, another the pool house, and the third was for the cellar where they kept extra linens and cleaning supplies. He pointed at his watch and held up 8 fingers, then pointed at the morning sun, which we understood meant he'd check on us at 8 the next day. After he left, Jenna and I explored every inch of the place, marveling at the frescoed ceilings and the clawfoot bathtub big enough for 2 people, both of us giddy with disbelief that we'd scored such an incredible place for basically nothing. That first day passed like a dream sequence from one of those travel shows, where impossibly attractive couples drink wine at golden hour. We cooked pasta with tomatoes from the garden, skinny dipped in the pool under a blanket of stars, and made love on the terrace while crickets provided the soundtrack. Around midnight, exhausted from travel and too much Chianti, we collapsed into the massive 4-poster bed in the master bedroom. The mattress was one of those ancient horsehair things that molded perfectly to your body, and within minutes I was unconscious, not even stirring when Jenna got up to use the bathroom around 2 in the morning. The next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the shutters. The church bells from some distant village were ringing 7 times, and the space next to me in bed was cold and empty. At first I figured Jenna had gotten up early to photograph the sunrise, something she always talked about doing but never actually managed, because she hated mornings more than anyone I knew. I called out her name while pulling on yesterday's shorts, checked the bathroom, the kitchen where yesterday's wine glasses still sat unwashed, then walked out to the pool expecting to find her floating on one of those ridiculous flamingo rafts we'd found in the pool house. But the water was perfectly still, reflecting the cypress trees like a mirror, and her camera bag sat untouched on the dresser where she'd left it the night before. I searched every room twice, even checking ridiculous places like inside the armoire and behind the heavy curtains, telling myself she must be playing some elaborate prank, even though Jenna wasn't the type to think scaring people was funny. The villa felt different in the morning light, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. 20 minutes into my increasingly frantic search, I remembered the cellar Giorgio had mentioned, the one we hadn't bothered exploring yesterday because we were too busy living out our Tuscan fantasy. The wooden door was tucked behind the kitchen, painted the same faded green as the shutters, with iron hinges that screamed like a dying cat when I pulled it open. The smell hit me immediately, not the musty wine cellar scent you'd expect, but something chemical and sharp, like industrial bleach mixed with copper. A single bulb dangled from a wire at the bottom of the stone steps, casting these weird dancing shadows that made it hard to see clearly. The floor was bare concrete, and even from the top of the stairs I could make out dark stains spreading in irregular patterns, some old and brown, others fresh enough to still look wet. My brain kept trying to rationalize what I was seeing, maybe wine spills or water damage, but then I noticed the zip ties scattered in the corner, the kind police use for mass arrests, and a pile of women's jewelry tangled together like someone had dumped out a drawer in a hurry. I stumbled back up those stairs so fast I cracked my shin on the stone edge, leaving a gash that bled through my shorts, but I didn't even feel it until later. My phone was dead upstairs, and when I tried to charge it, I realized the power had been cut sometime during the night. The landline in the kitchen, an old rotary thing we'd laughed about yesterday, had no dial tone. Even the Wi-Fi router, which had worked perfectly for Instagram posts the day before, was dark and unplugged, the cable severed clean through with what must have been wire cutters. I ran outside yelling Jenna's name until my throat went raw, but the hills just swallowed the sound, and I remembered we hadn't seen another house for miles on the drive in. The Fiat was still parked where we'd left it, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. Not even the clicking sound of a dead battery. Someone had removed the starter cable during the night while we slept in that too-perfect bedroom. Giorgio wasn't supposed to arrive until 8, but I kept checking my dead phone like it would magically tell me the time. The sun seemed frozen in place, and every sound from the woods made me jump, expecting either Jenna or whoever had taken her to emerge from the trees. I found a knife in the kitchen, one of those huge Italian bread knives, and sat on the front steps gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white. Birds kept singing like nothing was wrong, and the automatic sprinklers turned on at what must have been 7:30, spraying the garden in perfect arcs while my wife was somewhere being held by people who staged vacation rentals to trap tourists. When I heard the distinctive rattle of Giorgio's Alfa Romeo climbing the dirt road, I almost cried from relief. But as the car pulled up, I saw he wasn't alone. 2 other men sat in the back, both wearing the kind of clothes you'd expect on construction workers, and none of them looked surprised to see me standing there covered in blood from my shin, holding a knife, and absolutely losing my mind. The taller man said something to Giorgio in Italian that made him laugh, a sound that belonged in a bar among friends, not in this nightmare I was living. They approached slowly, hands visible and empty, like you'd approach a spooked horse, and Giorgio kept repeating, "Tranquillo, tranquillo," which I knew meant calm down. The second man, younger with a scar that split his left eyebrow in two, held up a cell phone showing a video of Jenna sitting in what looked like a warehouse. Duct tape over her mouth, but clearly alive, still wearing the sundress from yesterday. Giorgio finally spoke in his broken English, explaining that this was business, nothing personal, that my family would receive instructions for payment within 12 hours, and if everyone cooperated, we'd be back home telling this story like a bad dream. The scarred one pulled out a pair of those same zip ties I'd seen in the cellar, and I actually considered fighting, 3 against 1 with my pathetic bread knife. But then I thought about Jenna in that warehouse and let the knife fall onto the gravel. They zip-tied my wrists in front of me, loose enough that I didn't lose circulation, almost professional in their efficiency, then walked me to a white van I hadn't noticed parked behind the villa. Inside, the walls were lined with foam soundproofing, and there were water bottles in a cooler, granola bars in a box, even a portable toilet behind a curtain, like they'd done this enough times to work out the logistics of keeping hostages alive and functional. During the ride, Giorgio sat next to me scrolling through his phone, occasionally showing me photos of other couples who'd stayed at the villa, their smiling faces by the pool, at the dinner table, the same spots where Jenna and I had posed less than 24 hours ago. He explained in his limited vocabulary that most families paid within 3 days, that they had contacts at Western Union who made sure the transfers went through quickly, and that only one couple had ever tried to involve the police, which hadn't ended well for anyone. The younger guy drove while the tall one made phone calls in Italian, mentioning dollar amount that made my stomach turn, knowing my parents would have to sell their house to even get close to what these men expected. The warehouse was about 40 minutes away, tucked into an industrial area outside Arezzo, where the sound of machinery would mask pretty much anything. They kept us in separate rooms, but every few hours they'd let me see Jenna through a window, always from a distance, always brief, just enough to confirm she was still breathing. They gave us bottled water, sandwiches from a local shop, and even let us use a real bathroom with supervision, maintaining this weird professionalism like they were running a hotel instead of a kidnapping ring. On the second night, Giorgio brought me a cell phone to call my father, coaching me through exactly what to say, how to ask for the money without mentioning Italy or the police, just telling him we'd gotten into serious trouble and needed help immediately. I heard my dad's voice crack when he said he'd figure something out, and Giorgio nodded approvingly, patting my shoulder like I'd done a good job. They moved us twice over those 3 days, always at night, always in different vehicles, until I completely lost track of where we were. On the morning of the 4th day, they drove us to a rest stop near the A1 motorway, handed us our passports and a burner phone with one number programmed in it, and told us to call that number in exactly 1 hour to get our car keys back. Giorgio shook my hand before leaving, like we'd just concluded a business deal, and reminded me that they had our home address, our parents' addresses, and that their organization had people in the States too, so talking to anyone about this would be inadvisable. We found our rental car at another location 20 miles away, keys under the mat as promised, with just enough gas to reach the airport. Jenna didn't speak for the entire drive, just stared out the window at the Italian countryside that had seemed so romantic 4 days ago. We told the rental agency someone had stolen our car, and we'd found it abandoned. Told our families we'd gotten mixed up with some dangerous people but managed to pay them off, and never once mentioned the villa or the truth to anyone except you strangers on this forum, because honestly, who would believe us anyway? And more importantly, we still get emails sometimes from Italian addresses we don't recognize, just photos of tourist couples smiling by pools, a reminder that Giorgio and his friends are still out there, still watching. The turquoise water looked exactly like the photos when we arrived at Isla Solitaria, this exclusive eco-resort that my wife Natalie and I had saved 3 years to afford. We'd been together since college, and after all those years of cheap dates and ramen dinners, we thought we'd found paradise on this tiny private island, about 40 miles off the coast of Belize. The place only hosted 12 couples at a time, and the owner, this silver-haired British guy named Cromwell, personally greeted each guest at the dock with fresh coconut water and a rehearsed speech about sustainable tourism. Everything felt perfect that first afternoon. The thatched roof bungalows, the infinity pool overlooking the reef, the way the staff remembered your name after hearing it just once. We spent the evening chatting with other couples over rum cocktails, everyone sharing their wedding stories and travel plans, completely unaware that within 24 hours, we'd be fighting for our lives. That first night, the storm hit around midnight with a violence I'd never experienced before, even growing up in hurricane country. The wind sounded like freight trains colliding, and the rain hammered our bungalow's roof so hard that Natalie and I had to shout to hear each other from 3 feet away. The power flickered out around 2 in the morning, and we huddled together in the suffocating darkness, listening to palm trees snapping like matchsticks outside. When dawn finally came, the island looked like a war zone. Debris everywhere, the beach reshaped, several structures damaged beyond recognition. But what really made my chest tighten was the silence from the other bungalows. We could see 8 of them from our doorway, and not a single person was visible. No voices carrying across the humid morning air. No movement except for the resort staff who were already out with wheelbarrows and machetes, cleaning up like nothing unusual had happened. Natalie grabbed my arm when we walked toward the main lodge for breakfast, her fingernails digging into my skin as she pointed at the Johnsons' bungalow, the retired couple from Minnesota we'd played cards with the night before. Their door hung wide open, the white curtains flapping like surrender flags in the breeze, and their suitcases were still stacked neatly by the bed, visible from where we stood on the sandy path. The lodge itself felt wrong the moment we entered. Only 3 tables had settings, despite 12 couples supposedly being on the island, and the usually chatty waitstaff moved around us in complete silence, avoiding eye contact like we were contagious. Cromwell appeared from his office, his linen shirt impossibly crisp despite the humidity, and announced that the morning boat to the mainland had been postponed due to dangerous conditions in the channel, though the sky was cloudless and the ocean looked calmer than a lake. We tried talking to the only other couple at breakfast, honeymooners from Canada whose names I never caught, but they kept glancing at the kitchen door every few seconds, their eggs untouched on their plates. The wife leaned across her table and whispered that she'd heard screaming during the storm, not wind but actual human screaming, and that their neighbors in Bungalow 6 had vanished along with their belongings, like they'd never existed at all. Her husband quickly hushed her when a waiter approached, but I noticed how his knuckles went white gripping his coffee mug, and how he flinched when Cromwell walked past our table with that practiced smile of his. Natalie and I decided to head back to our bungalow to pack. Something about the atmosphere made us both want to leave immediately, storm damage or not. But when we got there, our door was locked from the inside, and we could hear someone moving around in our room, opening drawers and shuffling through our things. The maintenance guy who opened our door for us, this weathered local named Baptiste with a scar running from his left ear to his collarbone, kept apologizing in broken English about confusion with cleaning schedule, while his eyes darted everywhere except our faces. Inside, our passports had been moved from the safe to the nightstand, spread open to the photo pages, and Natalie's jewelry box was sitting on the bathroom counter when she'd specifically left it buried in her suitcase. Baptiste hurried away before we could ask more questions, practically jogging down the beach path, and that's when I noticed all the staff members were wearing these identical silver medical bracelets I hadn't seen the day before, each one engraved with numbers instead of names. We started packing frantically, throwing clothes into bags without folding them, and I tried calling the mainland ferry service using the room phone, but the line just rang and rang, until eventually a recorded message in Spanish said the number was no longer in service. Natalie was zipping up her suitcase when we heard the Canadian woman screaming from somewhere near the pool area. Not a startled scream, but the kind that comes from pure terror, raw and desperate. We ran outside to find her standing alone by the pool bar, hyperventilating and pointing at the storage shed behind the kitchen, where her husband had gone to look for their missing snorkeling gear 10 minutes earlier. The shed door was padlocked now, and through the gap underneath, a dark puddle was spreading across the white sand, too thick to be water, too red to be anything but blood. Cromwell materialized beside us with 2 large staff members, island guys built like NFL linebackers, and calmly explained that her husband had unfortunately injured himself on some storm debris and was being treated in the medical facility on the other side of the island, though nobody remembered seeing any medical facility during yesterday's welcome tour. The Canadian woman kept screaming that she wanted to see her husband, begging Cromwell to take her to this supposed medical facility, but he just smiled that empty smile and had his men escort her away, supposedly to reunite her with her spouse. Natalie and I exchanged a look that said everything. We needed to get off this island immediately, boats or no boats. We rushed back to grab our bags and head for the dock, but the path was blocked by Baptiste and 3 other workers carrying metal coolers, the expensive medical kind with biohazard symbols, loading them onto a golf cart with practiced efficiency. When Baptiste saw us, he dropped his cooler, and it popped open for just a second. long enough for me to glimpse clear bags filled with ice and something dark red and organic looking, before he slammed it shut and started shouting at us in Creole to go back to our room, that it wasn't safe to wander around. We turned and ran the opposite direction, toward the dense jungle interior, where we'd seen a maintenance trail during yesterday's nature walk, figuring we could circle around to the dock from the other side. The path was barely visible under the storm debris, and we had to climb over fallen trees and wade through pools of muddy water that came up to our knees, all while hearing voices behind us getting closer, Cromwell's British accent mixing with rapid-fire Creole. About half a mile in, we stumbled into a clearing that shouldn't have existed, filled with medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a surgical suite. IV stands, monitors, those bright overhead lights surgeons use, all protected under military-style camouflage netting. There were gurneys arranged in rows, some still with dark stains on the white sheets, and a generator humming in the corner next to refrigeration units identical to the coolers we'd seen, their temperature displays glowing red in the jungle shade. Before we could process what we were seeing, Natalie grabbed a clipboard hanging from one of the gurneys, and her face went completely pale as she read it out loud. It was a medical chart with the Johnson woman's name at the top, listing her blood type, tissue compatibility markers, and a detailed diagram of kidneys with harvest times noted in neat handwriting. The chart underneath had the Canadian man's information, check marks next to liver and corneas, with processing complete stamped across the bottom in red ink. That's when we heard the boat engine starting up at the dock. Not the resort's usual shuttle, but something bigger, more powerful, and Cromwell's voice carrying through the trees, telling someone on a radio that they had 2 more matches for the Mumbai buyer and to prep the facility immediately. We dropped everything and ran harder than I've ever run in my life, crashing through vines and branches, not caring about the cuts and scrapes, just needing to reach that dock before the boat left us stranded with these monsters. The jungle opened up suddenly and we burst onto the beach about 200 yards from the dock, where a sleek speedboat was being loaded with those same medical coolers by men in surgical scrubs. Natalie spotted a small motorboat tied up on the far side of the dock, partially hidden behind the dive shop, probably used by staff for supply runs to nearby islands. We stayed low, using the storm-scattered palm fronds and debris as cover, creeping along the tree line while the loading crew focused on their grim cargo. Just as we reached the dive shop, Baptiste emerged from behind a stack of oxygen tanks, holding a syringe filled with something clear, his scarred face expressionless as he moved toward us with the practiced calm of someone who'd done this before. Natalie swung her beach bag at Baptiste's head with everything she had, connecting with a sick thud that sent him stumbling backward into the tanks, the syringe flying from his hand into the sand. We didn't wait to see if he got up. We sprinted for the small boat, fumbling with the mooring ropes while shouts erupted from the main dock, Cromwell's British accent cutting through the chaos, ordering his men to stop us at any cost. The engine took 3 pulls to start, coughing black smoke before finally roaring to life, and we shot away from the dock just as 2 men reached the spot where we'd been standing, one of them diving into the water after us but quickly giving up as we gained distance. Behind us, the island grew smaller, that paradise facade hiding its nightmare reality, and Natalie steered us toward a fishing boat we could see on the horizon while I kept watch for any pursuit, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. The fisherman who picked us up spoke limited English but understood enough when we kept repeating police and emergency, and they radioed the Belize Coast Guard while racing us toward the mainland at full speed. It took 3 days of giving statements, identifying photos of missing tourists from across the Caribbean, and working with international investigators before they raided Isla Solitaria, finding the surgical facility still intact but the staff long gone. Cromwell vanished like smoke. They recovered evidence of at least 40 victims over 2 years, mostly young healthy couples who'd won discount packages to the resort or booked through specific travel sites that turned out to be fronts. We testified via video link at several trials, helped shut down 3 connected operations in Central America, and still wake up sometimes thinking we're back in that bungalow, hearing footsteps on the sand outside. The investigator told us we were lucky. Most couples who checked into places like Isla Solitaria never checked out at all, just became names on missing persons reports that nobody ever solved. Their organs sold to the highest bidder, while their families wondered why they stopped answering emails from paradise. The nightmares haven't stopped since Vermont. Every single night brings me right back to that cabin, to those woods, to the moment everything went wrong. Sleep doesn't come easy anymore. When it does, I wake up screaming his name, drenched in sweat, reaching for someone who isn't there. It's been 8 weeks now, and the therapist says writing it all down might help, that sharing what happened could be part of the healing process. Part of me doubts anything will ever heal this wound, but here goes nothing. At 28, I thought I had life figured out. Decent job at a marketing firm in Boston. Finally married to my college sweetheart Nathan after 6 years of dating, and ready to start the next chapter of our lives together. We'd saved for 2 years for the perfect honeymoon, but with everything going on in the world, we decided to skip the tropical beaches and find something more intimate, more us. Nathan found the listing on this obscure rental site, and the moment we saw those photos of the cabin nestled between pine trees with mountain views, we knew it was exactly what we wanted. The drive up there in early October should have been romantic. Leaves changing colors, winding roads through small towns where everyone waves at strangers. The kind of New England postcard scenes you see in movies. Nathan kept making jokes about horror movie setups, asking if I'd packed my running shoes just in case we needed to escape some backwoods killer. I remember laughing, playfully punching his arm while he drove our rented SUV deeper into the wilderness. The GPS lost signal about 40 minutes before we reached the property, but the owner, Harold Brennan, had sent detailed directions that Nathan had printed out old-school style. Each turn took us further from civilization. First the paved roads became gravel, then dirt, until finally we were bouncing along what could barely be called a path. When we finally saw the cabin through the trees, it took my breath away. Not because it was beautiful, though it had its rustic charm, but because of how completely alone it felt. The nearest neighbor was supposedly 8 miles away, and cell service was non-existent. Harold had mentioned this in his emails, even suggesting we could pay extra for a satellite phone if we wanted. We'd declined, thinking it would be romantic to be completely disconnected for a week. Harold met us at the cabin around 4 that afternoon, pulling up in a mud-splattered pickup truck that had seen better decades. He was nothing like I'd imagined from our email exchanges, maybe early 60s, thin as a scarecrow, with these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink enough. His handshake felt like grabbing a dead fish, cold and slightly damp, and he had this habit of licking his lips between sentences that made my skin prickle. He walked us through the cabin, showing us how to work the wood stove, where the firewood was stacked, how to prime the water pump if it got temperamental. The whole time he kept mentioning little things about previous guests, how the Andersons loved the sunrise from the bedroom window, how the Patel family had spotted a moose near the creek, how some photographer from New York had taken award-winning shots from the back deck. At the time, I thought he was just being a chatty host, trying to make us feel welcome. Nathan even joked later that Harold probably didn't get much company living out here. Before leaving, Harold handed us a laminated sheet with emergency numbers and pointed to a red mark on a hand-drawn map showing where we might get 1 bar of cell signal if absolutely necessary. About a 15-minute hike up the nearest hill. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We cooked breakfast together on the ancient gas stove, went for long walks following deer trails through the woods, made love in the afternoon when golden light streamed through the bedroom windows. Nathan had brought his guitar, and we'd sit on the porch in the evenings while he played old songs badly, and I laughed at his made-up lyrics. The isolation felt like a blessing. No work emails, no social media, no news about the outside world. Just us, the mountains, and the occasional wildlife visitor. On the second night, we saw a family of raccoons investigating the garbage bins, and Nathan spent 20 minutes trying to get the perfect photo with his camera. The cabin itself was cozy in that rustic way city people romanticize. Handmade quilts on the beds, cast iron pans hanging in the kitchen, shelves lined with yellowed paperbacks and board games from the 70s. There was something odd about the decor, though. Mixed in with the typical cabin stuff were these random mirrors, not decorative ones, but plain, functional mirrors placed in weird spots. One faced the bed at an angle, another was mounted high in the corner of the living room, and there was even a small one in the shower that served no obvious purpose. I mentioned it to Nathan, but he just shrugged and said, "Old houses always have weird quirks from different owners over the years." Everything changed on our third night. We'd spent the day hiking to a waterfall Harold had marked on his map, and we were exhausted in that good way that makes you sleep like the dead. Around 2 in the morning, Nathan suddenly sat up in bed, fully alert. I remember the moonlight catching his profile as he tilted his head, listening to something I couldn't hear yet. Then it came. A rhythmic creaking sound from somewhere outside, like metal swaying in the wind. Except there was no wind that night. The trees outside our window stood perfectly still in the moonlight. Nathan whispered that it sounded like it was coming from behind the cabin, near where the old tool shed stood. We lay there for maybe 10 minutes, just listening as the sound continued, steady and deliberate. Finally, Nathan's protective instincts kicked in. He pulled on his jeans and boots, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and told me to lock the door behind him. I begged him not to go, even offered to come with him, but he insisted it was probably just a loose gutter or maybe an animal caught in something. He kissed my forehead and said he'd be right back. Just wanted to make sure everything was secure so we could sleep peacefully. Those were the last words he ever said to me. I watched from the bedroom window as his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, moving along the side of the cabin toward the back. The creaking stopped the moment he rounded the corner out of my sight. I waited, counting my breaths, telling myself he'd reappear any second with some silly explanation. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At the 15-minute mark, I called out his name from the window, quietly at first, then louder. Nothing. Not even an echo back. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, no night birds. That kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your heart pound because nature is never that quiet unless something is very wrong. I threw on my coat over my pajamas, grabbed the only other flashlight we had, a weak penlight from my purse, and stepped out onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under my feet, the sound explosively loud in the unnatural quiet. I made my way to the corner of the cabin where I'd last seen Nathan's light, my pathetic beam barely penetrating the darkness. Behind the cabin, the tool shed door stood wide open, swinging slightly despite the still air. Nathan's flashlight lay on the ground about 10 feet from the shed, still on, its beam pointing toward the tree line. Next to it, dark stains in the dirt that looked black in the darkness but would later be confirmed by police as blood. Panic took over every cell in my body. I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me, my mind racing through options that all seemed impossible. No cell phone service, no car keys. Nathan had them in his pocket. And the nearest help was 8 miles through woods I didn't know in pitch darkness. I remembered Harold's map with the cell signal spot and grabbed it with shaking fingers, but the thought of hiking 15 minutes uphill alone, leaving the relative safety of the cabin, knowing something had happened to Nathan out there, paralyzed me. I did the only thing I could think of. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, pushing the heavy dresser against the door, and sat on the bed clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for dawn. Every sound made me jump. The settling of wood, the hum of the old refrigerator, a branch scraping the roof. I called Nathan's name every few minutes, hoping against hope he'd answer, that he'd stumble back injured but alive. The hours until sunrise felt like days. When the first gray light finally filtered through the trees, I forced myself to venture out again. The blood trail led from where the flashlight lay toward the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth about 20 yards in. There were drag marks in the dirt, 2 parallel grooves like something heavy had been pulled. Nathan's wedding ring, the one we'd picked out together just 3 months ago, lay in the dirt near the tree line, and seeing it there broke something inside me. The hike to get cell signal was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Every shadow could be whoever took Nathan. Every sound might be footsteps following me. When I finally got one bar of signal, my fingers could barely work the phone to dial 911. The state police arrived within an hour, followed by search and rescue teams with dogs. They treated me like I might be a suspect at first, asking the same questions over and over until I could barely speak through my sobs. The dogs picked up Nathan's scent immediately, following it deep into the woods before losing it at a creek about half a mile from the cabin. That's when one of the younger officers, sweeping the area with fresh eyes, noticed something odd about a tree near the tool shed. There was a small device attached to the trunk about 12 feet up, painted to match the bark. A camera. Once they found the first one, they found dozens more, in trees under the eaves of the cabin, hidden in birdhouses everywhere. The technical team they brought in said it was a sophisticated setup, all wirelessly connected, all with night vision capability. Inside the cabin, what I'd thought were oddly placed mirrors turned out to be two-way glass with more cameras behind them. The bedroom, the bathroom, the living room. Every inch of that cabin had been under surveillance. The investigation moved fast after that. Within hours, they'd traced the camera feeds to a server farm in Harold's basement, not his main house, but a property he owned about 3 miles away. The FBI got involved when they discovered the scope of what he'd been doing. For 11 years, Harold had been running a subscription website on the dark web, where people could pay to watch unsuspecting guests at his 3 rental properties in real time. The Vermont cabin was his most popular stream, apparently, because of its isolation. Subscribers could even pay extra to make requests, to vote on which couples to target for special experiences. They found chat logs where viewers discussed intimate moments they'd watched, rating guests like they were performers, sharing screenshots, making predictions about relationships. One regular viewer, username BearHunter47, had paid Harold $20,000 for what he called an interaction package the week we were there. The police showed me his messages, and I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. He'd been watching us since we arrived, commenting on everything from what I wore to bed, to how Nathan liked his coffee. He'd specifically requested that Harold create a situation to separate us on our 3rd night. Harold broke down during interrogation and gave them everything. He admitted to using speakers hidden in the woods to create sounds that would lure curious guests outside at night. Usually nothing more happened. He just wanted dramatic footage for his viewers, people getting scared, maybe some arguments between couples. But BearHunter47 was different. Harold claimed he didn't know exactly what the man had planned, just that he'd arrived that afternoon before the creaking sounds started, that he was supposed to wait in the tool shed, and that Harold would get another payment once he completed whatever he intended to do. The man's real name was Christopher Voss, a 43-year-old logistics manager from New Hampshire, with no prior record, just a normal-looking guy with a wife and 2 kids who spent his evenings watching strangers through hidden cameras. The police found Nathan's blood in his van, along with rope, surgical tools, and a collection of items taken from previous guests Harold couldn't explain. Pieces of jewelry, driver's licenses, even a journal from a woman who'd stayed at the cabin in 2017. They tracked Voss to a hunting property his family owned in the White Mountains. By the time they got there, he'd already burned most of the evidence, but they found enough DNA evidence to connect him to Nathan and at least 2 other missing persons cases from New England. They never found Nathan's body. Voss refused to talk even with a plea deal on the table, just sat there with this blank expression during every interrogation. The prosecutors said they had enough physical evidence to convict him without a confession. Nathan's blood in his vehicle, his DNA at the cabin, the digital trail of payments and messages. He got life without parole, but that doesn't bring Nathan back. Harold got 25 years for his part in it all, and they're still tracking down the hundreds of subscribers who'd been watching his streams over the years. Some were just lonely perverts, but others, like Voss, were something much worse. The FBI agent assigned to my case told me they'd prevented at least 3 other planned interactions after seizing Harold's servers. 3 other couples who have no idea how close they came to living through what I did, or worse. The other 2 properties Harold operated were in Maine and New Hampshire, both marketed to couples looking for romantic getaways. The agent said some subscribers had been watching the same couples year after year, since many returned for anniversary trips. One couple had been watched on 4 different occasions without ever knowing it. Their most intimate moments broadcast to strangers who discussed them like characters in a TV show. What haunts me most isn't just that Nathan is gone. It's knowing that our last days together, what should have been private moments between newlyweds, were entertainment for strangers. They watched us make breakfast, saw us kiss goodmorning, observed our little arguments about which trail to hike, witnessed our lovemaking. Every sweet nothing Nathan whispered to me, every inside joke we shared, every vulnerable moment. All of it was consumed by people sitting in dark rooms, getting off on our privacy being violated. I found out later that clips from our stay were already being shared on certain forums before Nathan disappeared, tagged with our first names and descriptions of us, like we were adult performers. Sometimes I wake up at night, convinced I can feel eyes on me even in my new apartment with its checked and rechecked locks, its absence of mirrors, its every corner examined for cameras. I've moved twice since October, changed jobs, legally changed my last name back to my maiden name to make myself harder to find online. But I know those videos are still out there somewhere, that strangers still have pieces of our life together, our last week together. The FBI says they're doing everything they can to scrub them from the internet, but we all know that's impossible. Once something is online, it's there forever, being traded in dark corners by people who see tragedy as entertainment. Nathan's mother calls sometimes, and we cry together, bonded by this specific kind of loss that no one else can really understand. Losing someone not just to murder, but to a spectacle, a show we never auditioned for. Northern Michigan gets empty after Labor Day, which is exactly why Melissa and I decided to book a lakefront cottage for our 5th anniversary in early September. My wife had been working double shifts doing medical transcription all summer, and between that and my online teaching gig, we desperately needed to disconnect from everything. A colleague mentioned this booking site where owners dump their properties for cheap when they get last-minute cancellations, and that's how we found the place, a 2-bedroom cottage with its own dock, surrounded by pine forest, going for less than what we'd normally pay for a motel room. 5 years of marriage and approaching 30 had taught us both to recognize a good deal when we saw one, even if the photos looked a bit dated and the reviews were strangely sparse. We packed our Honda Accord with enough groceries for a week, threw in our swimming gear and some books we'd been meaning to read, and drove 6 hours north from Chicago through increasingly desolate stretches of highway. The GPS lost signal twice in the final hour, leaving us to navigate by a hand-drawn map the owner had emailed, complete with landmarks like Big Dead Oak and rusted blue mailbox. When we finally pulled into the gravel driveway that Thursday afternoon, the isolation hit us immediately. Nothing but trees, water, and silence. The cottage had that distinct character of a place frozen somewhere around 1987. Wood paneling on every wall, a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since Reagan was president, and kitchen appliances in various shades of harvest gold and avocado green. While Melissa tested the squeaky bed and unpacked our clothes into a dresser that smelled like mothballs and cedar, I wandered the property to get our bearings. The dock stretched about 20 feet into the lake, solid despite its weathered appearance, with an aluminum rowboat tied to the end, and a ladder descending into water so dark it looked like oil. Behind the cottage stood a padlocked shed, with a handwritten "Keep Out" sign that the owner had emphasized 3 times in his emails, though curiosity made me peer through a gap in the boards to see nothing but shadows and what looked like old furniture covered in tarps. The opposite shore of the lake lay maybe 300 yards away, just a thick wall of trees with no visible structures, no docks, no signs of life at all. That first evening passed like something from a movie about happy couples. We grilled burgers on the rusty charcoal barbecue, shared a bottle of wine while dangling our feet off the dock, and watched the sun sink behind the pines. Later, around 10:30, when I stepped outside to bring in our forgotten wine glasses, a pinprick of light caught my attention across the water, moving slowly between the trees on the far shore. Too steady and purposeful to be a firefly, too deliberate to be someone just out for a casual walk. Friday started with the kind of peaceful morning you only get at places like this. Loons calling across the water, mist rising off the lake like something supernatural, and Melissa making pancakes while wearing my old college sweatshirt. We spent the day doing absolutely nothing productive, alternating between reading on the dock, taking the rowboat out to the middle of the lake, and napping in the hammock strung between two massive pines. The water was colder than expected for September, but clean enough that you could see your feet, even when you were chest deep, and we found a family of painted turtles sunning themselves on a half-submerged log near the shore. Around dinner time, while I was starting the grill for our fish dinner, Melissa called me over to the living room window with a strange expression on her face. She pointed across the lake where someone was standing at the tree line, barely visible in the fading light, just a dark figure against the darker forest. We watched for maybe 5 minutes, debating whether to wave or ignore them, when the person raised what looked like binoculars to their face, pointed directly at our cottage. The moment I raised my hand in an awkward greeting, they stepped backward into the trees and vanished, leaving us both with that uncomfortable feeling you get when you realize you've been watched without knowing for how long. That night, we tried to laugh it off over dinner, making jokes about creepy locals and city folks who didn't understand rural curiosity, but neither of us felt quite as relaxed as we had the night before. Melissa suggested we close all the curtains, something we hadn't bothered with the first night since there was supposedly no one around to see inside anyway, and I found myself double-checking that all the doors were locked before we went to bed. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing the bathroom and noticed a soft glow coming through a gap in the bedroom curtains. At first, I thought it might be moonlight reflecting off the water, but when I carefully peeled back the fabric to peek outside, there was that flashlight again, scanning slowly back and forth across our cottage from the opposite shore. This time, though, the light would pause whenever it hit a window, lingering for several seconds as if the person holding it was trying to see inside, studying our place room by room. I watched, fascinated and disturbed in equal measure, as the beam methodically examined our rental, stopping longest at the bedroom window where I was standing, and I could swear that even across all that dark water, whoever was holding that light knew I was watching them watch us. Saturday morning brought an argument, the first real one we'd had in months, with Melissa insisting we should pack up and leave while I kept saying we were overreacting to what was probably just some local weirdo with boundary issues. She reminded me about the drastically reduced price, the sparse reviews, the way the owner had been so eager to confirm our booking within minutes of my inquiry, details that suddenly seemed less like good fortune and more like warning signs we'd chosen to ignore. But pride and stubbornness won out. I'd spent good money on this trip, planned it for months, and I wasn't going to let some creep with a flashlight ruin our anniversary. We compromised by agreeing to spend the day away from the cottage, driving 40 minutes to the nearest town where we ate lunch at a diner full of mounted deer heads and locals who stared at us like we'd grown extra limbs. The teenage waitress, after hearing we were staying at the old Carlson place by the lake, gave us this look that was equal parts pity and surprise, then quickly busied herself refilling our already full coffee cups. On the drive back, Melissa stayed quiet, scrolling through her phone trying to find any information about our rental, any reviews that might explain what we were dealing with. But the listing had somehow vanished from the booking site entirely. We got back to the cottage around 5, and the first thing I noticed was that the padlock on the shed was hanging open, the door slightly ajar despite the owner's explicit instructions to stay out. My first thought was that maybe he'd come by to check on something while we were gone, but there was no note, no missed calls, nothing to indicate anyone had been there legitimately. Against Melissa's protests, I walked over and pushed the door open wider, using my phone's flashlight to pierce the musty darkness inside. The shed was packed with the expected junk: moldy life jackets, broken fishing rods, stacks of waterlogged newspapers from the 90s. But along the back wall stood something that made no sense at all. A neat row of at least a dozen flashlights of varying sizes, all clean and modern-looking, arranged on a shelf like some kind of collection. Below them, thumbtacked to the wall, were what looked like printed screenshots from rental listing sites, showing different photos of our cottage across different seasons, each with different titles and descriptions, like someone had been creating and deleting listings over and over again. The real gut punch came when I noticed the dates on some of the printouts. Bookings going back 2 years, all for roughly week-long stays, all with different names highlighted in yellow marker. Melissa was already throwing clothes into our bags when I got back to the cottage, her face pale and her jaw set in that way that meant discussion was pointless. I started to tell her about the shed, but she cut me off, holding up her phone to show me something she'd found buried in a local Facebook group. A post from the previous summer, where someone asked if anyone else had experienced weird stuff at a lake rental in our area. The comments were mostly deleted, but one remained from a woman saying she and her husband had cut their stay short after someone kept watching them from across the lake, and that when they'd complained to the owner, he'd seemed confused and claimed he didn't know what property they were talking about. That's when the pieces started clicking together in the worst possible way. The too good price, the eager booking confirmation, the owner who only communicated through email and had insisted on payment through a wire transfer. We'd been so focused on the person watching us that we'd never considered the possibility that the actual owner of this cottage might have no idea we were even here. The sound of footsteps on the deck made us both freeze, heavy and deliberate. Definitely not an animal. And when I peered through the kitchen window, I saw a man standing at our door, not knocking, just standing there with one hand pressed against the wood like he was feeling for vibrations. He was maybe 60, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been washed in lake water and dried in the sun too many times. Everything slightly gray and stiff-looking, hanging on a thin frame that seemed built for crawling through small spaces. His hair grew in uneven patches, like he'd been cutting it himself without a mirror, and his fingernails were so long they clicked against the door as he ran his hands across it. When he finally knocked, 3 slow, measured raps, Melissa grabbed my arm so tight it hurt, shaking her head violently, but something in me needed to know what we were dealing with. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain on, and the smell hit me immediately. Mildew and earth and something chemical like old batteries. His eyes were the worst part, not threatening or angry, but eager in a way that made my stomach turn, like a kid about to show you his favorite toy. He asked if we were enjoying our stay in a voice that sounded unused, raspy, and too high for his size. And when I demanded to know who he was, he just smiled and said he was the one who'd been making sure we were safe at night, keeping watch from across the lake, making sure nobody bothered us. The flashlight hanging from his belt was one of those expensive tactical models, the lens still dirty with fingerprints from being held against windows. Before I could respond, he pushed something through the crack in the door, a stack of Polaroid photos that scattered across the floor when I instinctively stepped back. They were all of us, Melissa and me, taken from across the lake with what must have been a telephoto lens or high-powered scope, showing us through the windows at different times over the past 2 days. Eating breakfast, reading on the couch, getting ready for bed, private moments we thought were just ours, all captured with disturbing clarity. But mixed in with our photos were others, older ones with different couples in the same cottage, doing the same ordinary things, unaware they were being documented like specimens in some sick collection. The man kept talking while I stared at the photos, explaining in his broken voice how he'd been living across the lake for 15 years, how the cottage had been empty for so long until he figured out how to list it online, how he picked nice couples who looked like they needed a quiet getaway. The money from the rentals, he said, went into a separate account he'd set up to pay the property taxes and keep the electricity on, keep his watching post functional. He seemed genuinely confused when I started yelling at him to leave, tilting his head like a dog hearing a strange sound, asking if we didn't like how he'd maintained the place, if the sheets weren't clean enough, if we needed more towels. The situation spiraled fast after that. I slammed the door in his face while Melissa called 911, but our cell service kept cutting in and out, the calls dropping after a few seconds of static. Through the window, we could see him still standing on the deck, not trying to break in, just standing there swaying slightly like he was listening to music only he could hear. After 10 minutes of failed phone calls, we decided to risk it, grabbing our bags and car keys, leaving everything else behind. The moment we opened the door, he stepped aside politely, even offered to help with our bags, still seeming oblivious to why we were terrified of him. We ran to the car, and as I fumbled with the keys, he called out that he had something to show us, something that would explain everything, something special he'd built just for his guests. The engine turned over on the third try, and as we peeled out of the driveway, gravel flying everywhere. I saw him in the rearview mirror pulling up a metal hatch hidden in the ground near the shed, disappearing into whatever was beneath it like he was going home. We drove for 20 minutes before finding enough signal to call the police, our hands shaking so bad we could barely hold our phones. The sheriff's department took our report at a gas station parking lot, 2 deputies writing everything down while shooting each other looks that suggested this wasn't their first call about that cottage. They followed us back, bringing backup, and what they found turned into something that made the local news for weeks afterward. The man, whose name turned out to be Vernon Keller, was already gone, but the tunnel system they discovered beneath the property was extensive, a network of passages he'd dug over more than a decade, connecting the cottage to 3 different observation points around the lake, including a furnished underground room directly beneath the master bedroom. The walls of his main chamber were covered with those screenshots I'd seen in the shed, but also hundreds more photos of couples dating back years, all carefully organized in photo albums labeled with dates and names he'd apparently harvested from their fake booking confirmations. The police found his actual residence built into a hillside across the lake, camouflaged so well it was invisible from the water, where he'd been living off the rental income while perfecting his underground network. They said he'd been a mining engineer before some kind of breakdown in his 50s, which explained how he'd managed to construct such an elaborate system without it collapsing, complete with ventilation shafts hidden in tree stumps and waterproof lighting powered by cables he'd spliced from the cottage's electrical system. Vernon turned himself in 3 days later at a hospital in Wisconsin, dehydrated and rambling about how he just wanted to take care of people, to watch over them, to make sure couples were happy during their special time away. The detective who called us with the update said Vernon genuinely couldn't understand why what he'd done was wrong, kept insisting he'd never hurt anyone, never even entered the cottage while it was occupied, just watched to make sure everyone was safe and enjoying themselves. The real owners of the cottage, an elderly couple from Indiana who hadn't visited in 5 years, were horrified to learn their property had been turned into Vernon's personal human terrarium. They found our contact information along with 17 other couples who'd been scammed the same way, all of us thinking we'd gotten a great deal on a romantic getaway. The tunnel system has been filled in now, the cottage demolished, but sometimes I still dream about that moment, when I looked through our bedroom curtain and saw that flashlight searching our windows, knowing now that he wasn't across the lake at all, but possibly right beneath us, watching through some gap we never knew existed. Melissa and I are still together, stronger maybe because of what we went through, but we don't take remote vacations anymore, and she still checks under beds in perfectly normal hotel rooms, looking for holes that probably aren't there. June in Texas hits different when you're driving through the desert with someone you just married. Brian and I had been husband and wife for exactly 4 days, still giddy from our Dallas wedding, still figuring out how those words sounded when we said them out loud. The honeymoon plan was nothing fancy, just the 2 of us, a rental car and 3 weeks to drive wherever the roads took us through the Southwest. We'd head through Texas, cross into New Mexico, maybe reach Arizona before flying home from Phoenix. Both 27 that year, we'd been planning this trip forever. Brian managed construction sites in Houston. and I taught 5th grade at an elementary school near downtown. Every paycheck for 2 years, we'd put something aside, determined to start our marriage with an adventure. That first night after leaving Dallas, we'd crashed at some forgettable chain hotel outside Fort Worth. The second night, though, we decided to take the scenic route, driving south along roads that ran parallel to the border. The gas gauge read just above a quarter tank when we realized how badly we'd misjudged the distances between towns. Nothing but desert stretched ahead according to our phones, maybe 100 miles before the next actual city. Brian kept mentioning that Exxon station we'd passed an hour back, how we should have stopped, but I'd been eager to cover more ground before dark. Then we spotted this hand-painted wooden sign, weathered and leaning slightly. Desert rose in 2 miles, with an arrow pointing down a dirt road that branched off the main highway. The GPS showed nothing there, just empty space, but we could make out lights in the distance, golden and warm against the purple desert twilight. Brian gave me this look, half worried, half curious, and turned the wheel without either of us discussing it. The dirt road was brutal, full of holes that made our sedan bottom out twice, dust coating everything. But eventually we pulled up to this old Adobe-style building with a flickering neon vacancy sign. The place looked straight out of those old Western movies my dad used to watch, complete with wooden porch beams and actual swinging doors that led into what appeared to be the main office. A woman emerged before we'd even turned off the engine, like she'd been watching for us. Maybe 50, with graying hair pulled back in this impossibly tight bun, and wearing a floral apron over jeans and a checkered shirt. She had this way of smiling that made all her teeth show at once, waving at us with both hands like we were long-lost relatives finally come home. Behind her stood a younger man, probably early 30s, with arms thick as tree trunks and a beard that reached his chest. He didn't wave, just nodded once when our eyes met through the windshield. The woman practically bounced over to Brian's window, tapping on it with her knuckles before he'd even unbuckled his seatbelt. "Welcome, welcome, you two look exhausted. Come in, we've got the best room ready, always do for honeymooners." She said this before we'd mentioned anything about being newly married, but I figured maybe the just married soap writing on our back window gave it away, even though we'd tried to wash most of it off back in Dallas. The lobby, if you could call it that, was cramped but weirdly homey. Lots of old photographs covered every wall, all in mismatched frames. Pictures of families, cowboys, women in long dresses standing in front of the very building we'd just entered. A ceiling fan wobbled overhead, making this rhythmic clicking sound with each rotation. The younger man had followed us in, introduced himself as Tomas, said his mother Rosa owned the place, been in their family for 4 generations. Rosa bustled around behind a wooden counter that looked handmade, pulling out this ancient guest book, the kind with actual pages instead of a computer system. While Brian signed us in, she kept talking, mentioning how they rarely got guests anymore since the new highway was built 10 years ago. How lucky we were. They had a room available. How her daughter would be thrilled to have someone to cook for tonight. That should have been my first real warning. The place had a vacancy sign, but she acted like we were some massive stroke of luck for them. Tomas carried our suitcases without asking, just grabbed them from Brian and headed down a narrow hallway that smelled like old cedar and something else, something chemical I couldn't place. Our room was at the very end of the hallway, past 3 other doors that were all closed tight. Tomas unlocked it with an actual skeleton key, the kind you see in antique shops, and pushed the door open with his shoulder like it was stuck. The room itself was bigger than I expected, with a king-sized bed covered in this bright orange bedspread with geometric patterns that hurt to look at for too long. Everything seemed clean enough, but old. The furniture all dark wood with scratches and water rings, a box television from the 80s sitting on a dresser, thick curtains that blocked out any view of outside. Rosa appeared in the doorway while we were still looking around, announcing that dinner would be served in 20 minutes in the main house, that we simply had to try her daughter Carmen's enchiladas, the best in 3 counties. Brian tried to say we were tired. Maybe we'd just turn in early, but Rosa's face did this thing where her smile stayed exactly the same, but her eyes went hard. "Nonsense. You need to eat. Growing boys need their strength." She patted Brian's arm with more force than seemed necessary, then swept out of the room before we could argue more. We whispered about leaving right then, just getting back in the car and driving until we found somewhere else, anywhere else. But the tank was low. We didn't know how far the next gas station was, and honestly, we felt stupid for being paranoid about what was probably just an overly friendly family running a struggling business. The dining room was attached to the main building through a covered walkway that creaked with every step. Only one table was set, with actual cloth napkins and everything, candles already lit even though it wasn't fully dark yet. Carmen looked nothing like Rosa or Tomas, blonde where they were dark, skinny where they were broad, maybe 19 or 20 with nervous eyes that kept flicking toward the kitchen door. She served us plates piled high with food, enchiladas drowning in green sauce, rice, beans, some kind of meat I couldn't identify. Rosa sat at the head of the table, watching us eat, asking about our families, our jobs, our plans for children. Tomas stood by the door, not eating, just standing there with his arms crossed. The food tasted fine, good even, but there was so much of it, and Rosa kept insisting we finish everything, kept refilling our water glasses before they were even half empty. By the time we got back to our room, I could barely keep my eyes open. Brian was swaying on his feet, mumbling something about how he'd only had one beer with dinner, but felt like he'd drank a whole six-pack. We collapsed on that ugly orange bedspread without even changing clothes, just kicked off our shoes and passed out. The last thing I remember was hearing voices outside our window, speaking Spanish mixed with English, and the sound of a truck engine starting up. Then nothing, just this deep, heavy blackness that pulled me under completely. When I started coming back to consciousness, everything was wrong. The bed felt different, smaller, and the orange bedspread was gone, replaced by some rough gray blanket that smelled like mothballs and sweat. My mouth tasted like copper, and my head pounded so hard I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The room was different too. Concrete walls instead of wood paneling. No windows at all, just a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Brian wasn't there. I called his name, tried to sit up, but my arms and legs felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. The door, not the wooden one from our room, but a metal one with a slot at the bottom, was locked from the outside. I pounded on it until my fists went numb, screamed until my throat went raw, but nobody came. Hours passed, maybe days, hard to tell without windows. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps outside, voices speaking in Spanish, occasional laughter that sounded nothing like Rosa's friendly chuckle from that dinner. They'd slide water bottles and packages of crackers under the door slot, never opening it fully, never responding when I begged them to tell me where Brian was, what they'd done with him. The concrete walls had marks on them, scratches like someone had been counting days, and in one corner someone had carved, "Help me," in jagged letters. My wedding ring was gone, my phone was gone, my purse with our cash and cards. Everything gone except the clothes I'd fallen asleep in. The worst part was the not knowing. Was Brian in another room like this one? Was he looking for me? Was he even still alive? I found myself talking out loud just to hear a voice, even if it was my own, telling myself stories about how he'd escaped and was bringing help, how the FBI was probably already searching for us. But then I'd remember that vacancy sign, how the place wasn't even on GPS, how we hadn't told anyone exactly where we were going that day. My parents thought we were heading to New Mexico. Brian's family knew even less. We'd wanted to be spontaneous, go off the grid for our honeymoon. God, we were so stupid. On what must have been the third or fourth day, the routine changed. Instead of crackers, they slid a sandwich under the door with more water than usual, and the water tasted different, bitter and chemical, like the smell in that hallway at the inn. I tried not to drink it, but the thirst was unbearable in that concrete box. Within an hour, the room started spinning. My limbs went heavy again, and I felt myself sliding back into that same thick darkness. This time, I woke up in the back of a vehicle, bouncing along some rough road. My wrists were zip-tied, mouth taped shut, but I could see through a small window that we were in some kind of van. Two men sat in the front seats, neither of them Tomas. talking casually in Spanish about soccer scores and weekend plans like they were on any normal work commute. The van smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, and there were other shapes in the darkness with me. Bundles or bags, I couldn't tell. We drove for what felt like hours. Every time I started to focus, to try to remember turns or count minutes, another wave of whatever drug they'd given me would pull me back toward unconsciousness. At some point, I heard one of them make a phone call, mentioning numbers, not names, just numbers, and saying something about the teacher being ready for pickup. That's when it really hit me. I wasn't a person to them anymore, just product with a label, a profession that probably made me seem docile, trustworthy, easy to control. The van stopped suddenly, and I heard shouting outside, different voices, maybe an argument about money from what little Spanish I could understand. One of the men up front cursed, said something about "policía" and "checkpoint," and suddenly they were both out of the van, doors slamming, footsteps running. I waited, heart hammering, for someone to come back, but there was just silence, then distant sirens, getting closer. I started kicking the van walls, screaming through the tape, making as much noise as I could with my bound hands and feet. The sirens got louder and I heard car doors, radio chatter, someone speaking English with a heavy accent calling for backup. When they finally opened the van's back doors, the sunrise blinded me. 2 state troopers stood there, hands on their weapons, looking as shocked as I felt. They cut the zip ties, peeled off the tape, kept asking if I was hurt, where I'd come from, how long I'd been in there. But my brain was still foggy from the drugs, and all I could manage was Brian's name, over and over, begging them to find Brian. They found me on Highway 90, about 200 miles from where we'd stopped at the Desert Rose Inn, though I didn't know that until later. The officers said the van was registered to a fake company, and the men who'd been driving it were nowhere to be found. They took me to a hospital in Del Rio, where I spent 3 days getting the drugs out of my system and trying to make sense of what happened. The FBI got involved, said the inn was a known waypoint for trafficking operations, that they'd been investigating it for months, but could never get enough evidence. Rosa, Tomas, Carmen. None of those were their real names, and by the time law enforcement got to the inn, the place was abandoned, cleared out like nobody had ever been there at all. They found Brian 5 days later, wandering along a road near Laredo, dehydrated and confused but alive. He'd been kept in a warehouse with 6 other men, all being prepared for forced labor trafficking to farms across the border. He escaped when one of the guards got drunk and forgot to lock a door properly. We were lucky, they told us. Most people who disappear into these operations are never found, especially not alive and relatively unharmed. The GPS kept recalculating, its robotic voice cutting through the silence every few minutes as we climbed higher into the Rockies. Kevin had his hand on my knee, tapping along to some old rock song on the radio, while I watched the pine trees blur past my window. We'd left California that morning with the windows down and music blasting, still giddy from our wedding 3 days earlier. His parents had given us a week at their timeshare in Colorado as a wedding gift, and instead of taking the boring interstate route, we decided to let technology pick the scenic path. Every time the GPS offered a shortcut through the mountains, we took it, laughing about being adventurous newlyweds who weren't afraid of a little detour. By late afternoon, we were on a narrow road I couldn't even find a name for, surrounded by walls of rock on one side and a drop into nothing on the other. The grinding started subtle at first, like metal scraping against metal somewhere beneath the hood. Kevin turned down the radio, that little crease appearing between his eyebrows whenever something worried him. Within minutes, the sound got louder, angrier, and the steering wheel started fighting against his grip. He managed to wrestle the car into a small gravel pullout just as smoke began seeping from under the hood. The engine coughed once and died. I remember the sudden quiet after that, how you could hear the wind whistling through the canyon and nothing else. No traffic, no birds, just wind. Kevin tried his phone first, then mine. Neither had a single bar of service, The last car we'd seen had passed us maybe an hour ago, heading the opposite direction. The sun was already dipping behind the peaks, and I could see my breath when I stepped outside. We'd been standing there for maybe 20 minutes, Kevin with his head buried under the hood, pretending he knew what he was looking at, when we heard the truck. It came around the bend slow, its diesel engine echoing off the canyon walls long before we saw it. An old 18-wheeler, the kind with a sleeping cab attached, rust eating through the white paint job in places. It pulled up behind our car and sat there idling for what felt like too long before the driver killed the engine. The door opened with a squeal, and this massive guy climbed down. He must have been 6'4" at least, wearing coveralls that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His beard was streaked with gray and hung down to his chest, but it was his eyes that made me step closer to Kevin. They were this pale, watery blue, and they never seemed to blink. He looked at me first, then at Kevin, then back at me, and his mouth stretched into this wide grin that showed too many teeth. "Engine trouble?" he asked, but he was already walking toward us before we answered, his boots crunching on the gravel. His voice had this strange quality to it, soft but somehow invasive, like it was getting inside your head without permission. Kevin explained about the grinding noise and the steering, and the guy nodded along, but he never looked at Kevin while he listened. His eyes stayed on me, traveling from my face down to my feet and back up again, real slow and deliberate. I pulled my jacket tighter and moved behind Kevin, but the driver just shifted his position so he could keep watching me. "Name's Walter," he said, extending a hand toward Kevin but still staring at me. "I know these roads like the veins in my arms. Been driving them for 37 years, since before they even paved some of these stretches. Your lucky day I came along. Ain't nobody else gonna pass through here until morning, maybe later." Walter insisted on looking at the engine himself, waving Kevin aside with one meaty hand. He bent over the hood, making these humming sounds while he poked around, occasionally asking Kevin to try starting it. Each time the engine failed to turn over, Walter would straighten up and look directly at me, like he was checking to make sure I was still there. After the fourth attempt, he wiped his hands on his coveralls, leaving fresh grease stains on top of old ones. "Alternator's shot, maybe the serpentine belt too," he announced, scratching his beard. "Got some tools in my truck, might be able to get you going enough to limp to the next town, about 40 miles from here." He paused, tilting his head at me. "Course the lady might want to sit in my cab while we work. Getting mighty cold out here and I got heat, some coffee in a thermos. Real fresh, made it this morning." Kevin started to say I was fine, but Walter cut him off with this laugh that sounded like gravel in a blender. "Wasn't talking to you, friend," he said, still smiling but with something harder in his voice. "Lady can speak for herself, can't she? Besides, this kind of work, it's gonna take some time, maybe an hour, maybe two. No sense in her freezing out here watching us get our hands dirty." He took a step toward me and I could smell him. Diesel fuel, stale cigarettes, and something else. Something sour and wrong. "Got some sandwiches too. Bet you folks haven't eaten since lunch. The hunger gets to you up in these mountains. Makes you weak. Makes you see things that aren't there. Best to keep your strength up." His hand reached out like he was going to touch my arm, and Kevin moved between us. But Walter just chuckled and let his hand drop. "Protective husband. That's sweet. But these mountains got a way of changing people. You'll see." For the next hour, I watched them work while trying to stay warm, pacing back and forth on the gravel shoulder. Walter had produced a toolbox from his truck that looked ancient, full of instruments I couldn't name, some of them caked with what looked like dried mud or maybe rust. Every few minutes, he'd send Kevin to fetch something from the truck, a different wrench, a flashlight, a rag, and during those moments when Kevin was gone, Walter would stop working entirely. He'd just stand there watching me, wiping his hands slow and deliberate on a dirty cloth. "You remind me of someone," he said during one of these moments, his voice barely above a whisper. "Had the same color hair, same way of standing with your arms crossed. She came through here too, about 3 winters back. Never did find out what happened to her after her husband's car broke down." He smiled at my expression. "Mountains keep their secrets real good up here. Sometimes the snow melts in spring and hikers find things. Sometimes it doesn't. The temperature kept dropping and my fingers were going numb despite my gloves. Kevin's face had turned red from the cold and frustration as nothing they tried seemed to work. Walter suggested more and more elaborate fixes, each one requiring tools that happened to be deeper in his truck, sending Kevin further away for longer periods. During one of these trips, Walter moved closer to me than he'd been all evening, close enough that I had to take a step back against our car. "Your husband doesn't know much about engines," he said, his breath forming clouds between us. "City boy, right? They never learn the important things, how to fix what's broken, how to survive when things go wrong, how to keep the people they love from disappearing." His hand came up again, and this time he actually touched my hair, just a quick brush of his fingers, but it made my whole body go rigid. "So soft," he murmured. "Just like I thought it would be. You really should get in my truck. It's getting dangerous out here. Temperature's gonna drop another 20 degrees before midnight. You could die from exposure. Wouldn't want that pretty face turning blue." When Kevin came back carrying an ancient-looking battery charger, he found Walter standing too close to me, and his face went dark. "Step back," Kevin said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. Walter raised both hands in mock surrender, that horrible grin spreading across his face again, but he moved away slow, deliberate, like he was making a point about who was really in control. "Just trying to help," Walter said, "but seems like this fix ain't working anyway. Battery charger won't do nothing if the alternator's completely fried." He made a big show of checking his watch, an old wind-up thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Getting late. Here's what I'm thinking. I got a cabin about 8 miles up the road. Nothing fancy, but it's got heat. Phone that sometimes works. You folks could spend the night, and in the morning I can tow you down to town with my truck, unless you want to spend the night out here." Of course, like I said, temperature's dropping fast. Already below freezing, gonna hit 0 before long. Kevin and I exchanged looks, and I could see him weighing our options. Stay in the car and risk freezing to death, or go with Walter to some isolated cabin. Before we could discuss it, Walter added, "Could just take the lady if you want to stay with your car. Make sure nobody messes with it during the night. These mountains, they get all kinds of folks passing through. Some of them ain't as friendly as me." The way he said friendly made my skin prickle. Kevin immediately said no, we stay together, and Walter shrugged like it didn't matter to him either way. "Follow me then," he said, already walking back to his truck. "Road gets tricky in the dark. Easy to drive right off the edge if you don't know where the turns are. Happened to a family from Nevada last winter. Took 3 days to find them at the bottom of the ravine. The cold had preserved them real nice though, almost like they were sleeping." He climbed into his cab and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness that had settled complete around us. We had no choice but to get back in our car and let Walter tow us with a thick chain he produced from somewhere in his truck. The ride was nightmare-inducing, being pulled through the darkness on a narrow mountain road, our dead car swaying with each turn, completely at Walter's mercy. Kevin kept pumping the brakes to maintain some control, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Through the rear window of Walter's cab, I could see his silhouette, and sometimes I swear he was looking back at us through his mirrors instead of watching the road. After what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, Walter's truck slowed and turned onto a dirt path I wouldn't have seen even in daylight. Tree branches scraped against our windows as we were dragged deeper into the forest. Finally, a small structure appeared in the truck's headlights, a wooden cabin that looked like it had been built decades ago and forgotten. No other buildings visible, no lights except what came from Walter's truck, no sign that anyone else had been here in years. Walter unhitched our car and stood there in his headlights, waiting for us to get out. "Home, sweet home," he called out, his voice carrying strange in the thin mountain air. The cabin door wasn't locked, just pushed open when Walter leaned his shoulder against it. Inside, he lit a kerosene lantern that threw wild shadows on the walls, revealing a single room with a wood stove, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, and a bed in the corner covered with what looked like animal pelts. The smell hit me immediately, must, decay, and something chemical I couldn't identify. Walter started building a fire in the stove, humming that same tuneless sound from before. "Make yourselves comfortable," he said without turning around. "Got some beans in cans, some jerky I dried myself. Bathroom's the outhouse around back, but I wouldn't go out there alone. Had a woman get turned around in the dark last year, wandered into the woods. Found her 2 weeks later, about a mile from here. The animals had gotten to her by then." Kevin put his arm around me, pulling me close, and I could feel him trembling. From cold or fear, I couldn't tell. The next part comes in fragments, like a broken film reel with sections missing. I remember Walter opening a cabinet and pulling out a bottle of something clear, insisting we drink to warm our bones. Kevin refused at first, but Walter's demeanor changed, the fake friendliness dropping away like a mask. "I don't like ungrateful guests," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Man offers you shelter from freezing to death. Least you can do is share a drink with him." The liquid burned going down, tasted wrong, medicinal and bitter. Walter watched us drink, then poured another round and another. The room started tilting, the shadows from the lantern becoming alive, writhing on the walls. Kevin was saying something about needing to leave, standing up too fast. And then Walter was between him and the door, so much bigger than I'd realized. There was a struggle. I remember the sound of furniture breaking, Kevin yelling my name, and then a wet crack that made everything go silent. The last clear memory I have is Walter's face close to mine, his breath hot and foul, saying something about how the mountains had chosen me, how I was meant to stay. After that, it's just flashes, being dragged through snow, the cold so intense it felt like burning. Branches tearing at my clothes and screaming that might have been mine or might have been the wind. Then nothing. Complete blackness. I woke up walking along the highway as the sun was rising, covered in mud and pine needles. My clothes torn, no idea how I'd gotten there. A ranger found me like that, stumbling down the center line, unable to tell him anything except our names. They searched for Kevin for 3 weeks. They found our car at the pullout where it broke down, but no sign of the cabin, no tire tracks from any truck, and no one at any local store or gas station had ever heard of anyone named Walter fitting that description. The only evidence Kevin had ever been there at all was his wedding ring, found in the mud about 50 feet from our car, and scratch marks on a tree nearby that looked like someone had tried to climb it. The investigators kept asking me about the drugs in my system. A veterinary tranquilizer, they said, used for large animals. Enough to cause severe memory loss, but not enough to kill. They found traces of it in my blood, but nowhere else. No bottle, no syringe, nothing. They brought in search dogs, helicopters, even volunteer groups from 3 counties, but Kevin just vanished into those mountains like he'd never existed. 6 months later, I hired a private investigator who discovered something that still makes me wake up at night in a cold sweat. There had been 4 other couples over the past 15 years. Same story, car trouble on mountain roads, husband disappears, wife found wandering with no memory and the same drug in her system. All the women described a truck driver, but the details never matched up. Different names, different appearances, like they were describing different people entirely. The FBI got involved after that, said it might be multiple people working the same routes, maybe even people who communicate somehow, but they never found anything solid. I moved across the country, changed my name, tried to start over. But sometimes I still get postcards with no return address, just photos of mountain roads and 2 words written on the back. Still waiting. I don't know if Kevin is alive somewhere in those mountains, if Walter was real, or if there's something worse out there that my mind won't let me remember. All I know is that I'll never take another mountain road as long as I live, and when people ask me about being a widow, I tell them my husband died in a car accident, because that's easier than explaining that he simply disappeared into thin air while something unspeakable happened to me that my own mind has chosen to erase. The first few days by the Columbia River felt like a dream. The cabin sat close enough to the water, that you could hear the current humming against the rocks at night. My wife, Emily, had picked the place after scrolling through endless listings. She wanted somewhere quiet enough to hear her own thoughts, as she said. It was a simple wooden cabin, 1 bedroom, a porch swing, and a trail that wound through tall cedar trees behind it. We spent our evenings cooking together, talking about the future, watching the sun fade behind the hills. It felt peaceful, too peaceful maybe, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every creak in the walls. That night, we went to bed after a long walk by the riverbank. Emily had been laughing about how our shoes kept sinking into the mud, leaving long, uneven prints. I remember her falling asleep before me, one hand resting on my arm. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the gray light of dawn, and her side of the bed was cold. The blanket was folded back neatly like she had just stepped out for a moment. I called her name softly at first, thinking she had gone outside to watch the sunrise. But the cabin stayed silent, except for the steady whisper of the river. When I got up, I noticed the back door was wide open. Cold air drifted inside, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. Her shoes were still by the door. So was her jacket. Her phone sat on the table, screen dark. That's when something inside me began to tighten, a quiet panic that didn't make sense yet. I walked out to the porch, scanning the clearing. The morning mist hung low over the trees, thick enough that you couldn't see far. But the grass near the steps was pressed down, like someone had walked through recently. I called her name louder, stepping into the mist, barefoot and shivering. The trail behind the cabin looked undisturbed at first glance, just mud and pine needles. Then I noticed a single set of footprints, small ones, hers, leading away from the porch and toward the trees. They stopped abruptly near the edge of the clearing, as if she had vanished mid-step. But when I turned back toward the cabin, I saw something that made my throat tighten. New prints, deep and wet, leading back into the cabin. At first I thought maybe I was seeing things. The prints looked too large to be hers, the soles wider, the stride longer. They led from the back door through the kitchen and stopped right beside the bed where I had been sleeping. The floor was still damp. Tiny bits of moss and grit stuck to the wood. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to understand what I was looking at. I knew I had locked that door the night before. I always checked twice before sleeping. Someone had come inside while we were both asleep. I called the sheriff's office right away. A deputy showed up within half an hour, an older man named Wallace who looked like he had seen too much in his life to be easily impressed. He walked around the cabin, took a few notes, and shrugged. "People wander off all the time near the river," he said, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I told him about the footprints, both sets, but he barely glanced at them, said the mud could play tricks on the eyes. When he left, he promised to send someone to look around, but I could tell he didn't believe a word I'd said. That afternoon, I went searching on my own. The forest behind the cabin stretched for miles, thick with cedar and ferns that brushed against your clothes as you passed. The air had that heavy, quiet weight that makes every sound stand out. A snapping twig, a crow's call, your own breathing. I followed what I thought were her tracks deeper into the woods, but they started to overlap with others, larger ones, and then smaller again, circling back toward the cabin. It was like more than one person had been walking there, tracing the same path again and again. By dusk, I was back at the cabin, exhausted and covered in mud. The deputy hadn't returned. I went inside to wash up and noticed something strange near the window. A faint smudge on the glass, like a handprint pressed from the outside. I wiped it with a towel and felt the chill of the glass beneath my fingers. And that's when I noticed a faint shape on the tree line, just far enough away that I couldn't see its face. Someone was standing there, still as stone, watching the cabin. When I blinked, they were gone. I barely slept that night. Every time the wind moved through the trees, it sounded like footsteps. I sat up on the couch with the lights off, watching the dark outline of the forest through the window. Around midnight, the porch boards creaked softly, one by one, like someone testing their weight. I didn't move, I just listened. Then came a slow drag across the wood, the unmistakable sound of something wet being pulled. By the time I gathered the courage to flip on the porch light, the sound had stopped, and the only thing out there was a trail of mud leading down the steps. At sunrise, I went straight back outside. The mud trail ended near the water, where the soil gave way to rocks. That's when I noticed something half buried near the riverbank. A piece of fabric caught on a root. It was the sleeve of Emily's flannel shirt, torn clean through. I shouted her name again and again, but the wind carried the sound away. I felt like I was shouting into nothing. When I turned back, I realized there were more footprints along the shore. Not just 2 sets now, 4, maybe 5, crossing over one another, some heading toward the forest, some coming back. It looked like a crowd had passed through while I slept. When the sheriff finally returned later that morning, I showed him everything. He walked around with that same bored expression, then told me I might be seeing patterns that aren't there. He said people disappear near the river more often than folks realize. Hikers, campers, travelers. The water takes what it wants, he muttered, almost like a habit. Before leaving, he warned me not to wander alone. I asked if he believed she could still be alive. He didn't answer. That evening, I packed our things and left. I drove until the river was far behind me, but I still see that cabin every time I close my eyes. Some nights I dream I'm back there, standing at the doorway, watching muddy footprints form on the floorboards, one after another, like someone invisible is still pacing around that room. Emily's case is still marked as missing. They never found her, but sometimes, when it rains, I swear I can smell that same damp cedar air and hear the sound of footsteps just outside my window.